There we go. That's a little bit better. I'm not in the middle, but you know, that's worse things in the world. And you can see the boxes of my books behind me, but... Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jess Galaxie and today we're talking about author branding. So if you're not aware, I'm an indie author. However, I have also spent the last 10 years of my life working in marketing to my own detriment. Particularly, I started in an agency environment and then from the agency environment kind of moved specifically into content writing. Since I am a writer, writing is my main skill set. And yes, I do write professionally and then also write books on the side. People tell me all the time that I'm insane. I'm very much one of those people whose professional life and hobbies are basically the same, which people are like constantly like, what are you doing to yourself? So anyway, for the last 10 years, I've been working in marketing. I started in an agency environment where I learned a lot about branding, then moved on to doing in-house marketing where I was kind of handling the entire brand for tech startups, and I continue to stay in the tech startup space. If you watch any of my videos about my layoffs and things like that, you probably know all of this already. But because of that, I have a really good background in marketing and branding that I've discovered that a lot of other indie authors do not have. And so I started doing these like little, like I'll put one up here, these little Canva graphics where I just kind of talked about different topics that were coming up. Usually like if like something was coming up a bunch on Threads, I would make one and kind of talk about it. I've made one from like how to work with an artist to like make sure you get what you want for your cover to like how to make sure that your like Instagram graphics are super readable, because all of this is really important for indie authors and there's not really another way to learn it. And I know this information, so I figured I might as well start putting it out for people. And so that's kind of what bred this particular series that I'm gonna be doing on my channel now, which is more about indie authors. I don't know, if you guys think of a good title for this series, tell me. I don't really have one. It's just like indie author, like help and know-how and information. That being said, today we're talking about author branding, which is something that I think a lot of authors really struggle with because they tend to end up making their entire brand the book that they've most recently come out with, which can be really difficult because sometimes when you're trying to like market yourself, not only for the purposes of getting people to buy your books, but also to be able to get like speaking events and go to cons and things like that, it can be really difficult when you don't have like a brand identity of your own. And I know it sucks to be like, oh, as an author, like, you have to have a brand now. Everyone has to have their own, like, personal brand. But a lot of these things are just kind of how it goes nowadays, especially with, like, social media. And so I just thought I would talk about some very simple tips that you can use to make your branding a lot stronger. So for me, like, you'll see very quickly, if you look at my, like, Instagram, for example, if you scroll through it at all, you'll notice that a lot of my Instagram feed is very focused on my books, which I think is totally fine. But when you start to kind of, like, try and like talk about signing events and kind of make people aware of you as a person, it can be a little difficult to try and differentiate yourself from the books. I think that's important entirely because when you're trying to sell a book, you really want to be like laser focused in on that book. And then when you're trying to sell yourself, you don't want to necessarily be as laser focused on that book. That's why I'm talking about this today. This is why I think it's important. And so yeah, let's just get right into it. Now, I do want to preface that all of these branding tips can help you with your individual identity online, but it can also help you for the individual identities for your books. So especially if you're trying to market like a new series or something like that, you could also use these tips to help distinguish that branding from previous series you've done or previous books that you've put out. That being said, that was my last preface. So my first piece of advice is to simply pick a theme. So once you've picked a theme, it's going to become kind of the main centralized like backdrop for all of your posts related to your author identity. So for me, I do tend to use clouds. I do also use clouds for Feathers of Dawn and Armor of Dusk, actually. So like, yeah, I also just like clouds. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing if you do have some overlap, especially since I have some overlap. That's not really what I'm getting at here. So pick a theme. So my theme tends to be clouds. I tend to use clouds for a lot of my backgrounds and just various things that I post about related to my author journey. The reason I also like clouds is because there's just so many good cloud like stock images that you can use on Canva. And you're not gonna run into a lot of AI images, which is kind of key for me. More often you see an image of clouds that has been edited in some way, like they've put a filter or something like that over it to make it a particular color. Like obviously the one that I just showed, like for example, I'm just gonna hold this up the whole time. But like, for example, I put a purple filter over this to make it a little bit more purple. It also made the oranges a little bit more rich. And so you'll see a lot of that. You'll see more along the lines of like clouds that like have slight editing as opposed to like fully AI images. I strictly do not use AI in anything. And I just want to say, also, if you are an indie author, you might want to consider not using AI for anything, just because I think in this space, a lot of people are very anti-AI. And so because of that, I would just stay away from it entirely. Personally, I think it's unethical to be using AI imagery because of a lot of reasons. So that's why I don't use it. But if you don't feel the same for some reason, I would just suggest it because right now, if you're an indie author and you start using AI, people will call it out really quick, and that can be really damaging to your reputation. Rightfully so. Okay, anyway. Now, this theme can be just about anything. I use a lot of clouds. I use a lot of rabbits because I have pet rabbits. I also tend to use things that are a little bit witchy and a little bit more in the realm of like things that I tend to wear or how I would like to design my house, how I would like my house to look. That's a pretty good sign that I would be willing to incorporate it into my personal brand. So like really like ornate gold frames are another thing that I use pretty often. If you look at my author website, I have a header that is just like a bunch of framed images of myself and then my books and things like that. And you know, I kind of like that feeling of maximalism personally is something that I really like in my branding, mostly because like I like a very rich brand and I think it feels very authorly in a lot of ways. You know, you think of warm woods and, you know, like The Long Room, for example, and like books and old books and leather and things of that nature are very much associated with authors for a lot of reasons. And so therefore I tend to kind of lean towards that maximalist aesthetic. However, this is going to depend a little bit on your genre. So like, for example, romance tends to use a lot of these like cartoon covers. And these are more minimalistic and a little bit more simple, and so you might want to pick a theme that is a little bit more minimalistic and simple. That theme might just be like a particular group of colors that you use as your backsplashes and things like that. You know, it could also be like as simple as like, oh, you like to use gradients in a lot of your posts. And so I can always do another video on like how to apply this if you guys would like, but these are just like, I'm just giving tips for right now. Moving on, next tip. Speaking of colors, colors are the next thing I want to talk about. Defining your color palette can just be really helpful for your brand in general. Canva, if you pay for Pro, you can even make like a set of branding colors. Personally, I like to include a black and a white in this palette, so pick colors that you like, wherever you find it, whether you find it on Pinterest or on Canva or something like that. Pick that color palette, and then I would say even like set it as a brand in Canva if you have Canva Pro. I think that's a really good idea. It makes it easy to reference, and I would include a white and a black in that. So if you notice on a lot of my posts, my white and my black that I use consistently are not a 100% true black or a 100% true white. They're a little bit off on each of them. I just find that works a little better for me. They're a little bit more versatile when I am kind of doing things. I also think they don't look so harsh. Sometimes I think sometimes you see, especially posts that are using those that stark white or that stark black, it just kind of looks incorrect next to like their very pastel color palette. So that's something to keep in mind while you're doing this and you're picking your color palette. As far as like picking a color palette for a genre, I wouldn't worry about this too much, especially if you do want to eventually branch out into other genres, even if that is not something you have done now. However, at the same time, I want to say that like things that you would often find in the covers of your genres are maybe something you could consider for your brand, but make sure it's still something you like. Like if you don't like pastels, but you write romance, you don't have to have a pastel branded like identity online. It's not necessary. You also don't even necessarily need to like use pastels in your branding for your books. I think there's something to be said for using like jewel tones in a sea of pastels, for example. It can sometimes be really good. So this is not like, there's not a lot of hard and fast rules about colors, but I would say picking a color palette is really important. I tend to use greens and purples because that's just kind of what I like. Could you guess that I like greens and purples? And I don't have a lot of green rep on my books, but you could tell really fast if you look at any of my, like, I can pick this thing up again. Here we are again. Can you tell that I like greens and purples? I would make a joke about this room being green, but I actually didn't pick this color. This was the color this room was when I moved in. Fun fact. Yeah, so that's something to keep in mind. And I think overall with color is just like pick something that's fun and vibrant and that you like. Well, I guess it doesn't have to be vibrant, but pick something fun that you like. Otherwise you're gonna have a really hard time trying to like make everything work. Like if you're not like if like you hate orange, for example, like you don't have to use orange in your branding, even if like every single cozy fantasy author like tends to use a ton of orange because there's so much association with like the autumnal season. But I would highly recommend having like 4 or 5 that work well for you and that you really like, and then 2 that you use most often. That's what I would say. I don't know, that just works well for me. So moving on to tip number 3, the thing that I think is really important for a lot of authors and that I kind of failed on with my first book especially is having an author website and like just like a basic author splash page that is completely separate from my book. The reason I say that is because it's a little hard once you start adding books to have a collected place if your website title is like feathersofdawn.com, like mine is. So like I didn't want to have to like maybe 4 or 5 books down the line when people ask me like, oh, what's your website? Like I didn't want to have to tell them like, oh, feathersofdawn.com, which is the name of my debut. I want to have that splash page, that author page, like right away. If you can, it's ideal. You don't need to do this immediately. I will say it can help your branding if you're trying to do like events and things like that. It's a really good idea to have on hand. When I say splash page, by the way, I just mean a basic homepage. It's like your name or your pen name and then photo of you and then some like basic about information and then like maybe a newsletter contact list or something like that for you to collect emails and things. For people who kind of want to stay in contact with you. And then, you know, like your social media links or like where to follow you or more information about your books, things like that. So that's all you really need on there. It's like 4 or 5 like modules. You can just build it in like a click and ship, that's not the right term, drag and drop builder. Like I used GoDaddy's like basic drag and drop builder for mine. I actually use GoDaddy for the Feathers of Dawn website as well. A lot of people will get intimidated by websites in particular, both because you have to pay for a domain and then you have to host it and you have to continue to pay for that hosting and pay for that domain over time. It can seem like a really big expense. So obviously this isn't something you have to do right away, but once you start moving into that space where you're like, I want to be kind of known as like my own entity, my own author, separate from my books, it's a really good thing to have. And it also makes it easier to have like a business card where you can hand something off and all of your books are on there. This is kind of more planning for the future more than anything, but I do think it does overall like help your brand. So number 4 is actually just have a brand separate from your books. I know I've mentioned this already and throughout this video that having a brand that is separate from your books can be really, really helpful to help distinguish you as an author, and especially if you are going to potentially be publishing in multiple different genres under the same pen name, you might not want to necessarily brand yourself strictly with a book. And so that's kind of what I've been talking about this entire time, of course, but you know, when it comes down to it, having branding for your books versus yourself is going to help you distinguish to people that you are going to be doing more than maybe just this series. And it can help you build a community around you of people who really just enjoy your writing and want to continue following you, even if you're not necessarily writing in their preferred genre anymore. Now, by no means do I mean that you should be like some kind of influencer, have this like personal brand that is like completely separate from your books. And you know, we see that sometimes a little bit with authors, but it's not necessarily a necessity. And I do think that in a lot of situations, authors would benefit from being able to like have kind of a separate brand from their books. Now, there are things you can do, obviously, to play with this a little bit. Like, I have a friend who's a pirate author. Her book is actually sitting like... Anyway, but my friend Madeline, who wrote Caraway of the Sea, like, she goes to signing events dressed up as a pirate because she wrote a pirate book. And I think that's great. So again, I don't think it is strictly that you can never blend these things, but I do think that having them distinguished can help people see you as a person and help associate you with someone that they want to continue to follow beyond maybe you writing their favorite cozy fantasy book or you writing their favorite pirate novel. Maybe if all they read is pirate novels, they would still read a contemporary romance from you if they like you kind of as a person. Like I said, like, you're not necessarily trying to be an influencer, but you know, know, it doesn't really hurt. Taking some cues from influencers, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing for authors nowadays. Another big thing about distinguishing them is that having kind of like a set brand for your books and then a set brand for you also just allows those books to kind of have their own branding in a way that's going to feel very cohesive and nice. A lot of people, when they do branding for their books, they really focus on the colors of the cover and things like that, which I think works. But also, if you kind of expand that brand a little bit, I think it also gives you the opportunity to have kind of very nice imagery that like influencers and readers can use when they make reviews and they talk about it on social media and things like that. So that makes it a little bit easier for them to kind of follow in with your brand when you have a very cohesive brand for your books. And that's also the same thing when it comes to being an author, is then when you have like a very cohesive brand as an author that is separate from all of that, it makes it very easy for you to brand yourself when you're going to be like at events. Like I hosted a talk for HearthCon last year, and you know, it was much easier for me to kind of talk about HearthCon and use the HearthCon branding, but also meld it with kind of my own personal branding. And having an idea of what your own personal brand looks like before you're trying to do something like that can be really helpful. So the last thing, and my last final fifth tip, my final, now that I'm saying tip a lot, it sounds weird. It sounds no longer like a word. And this is the thing that I think a lot of authors get right from the very beginning. But I do think having a voice and tone and understanding what your voice and tone is from the start can be really, really helpful. When I say that, I'm referring to like how you talk about yourself online, how you talk about your books online. And a lot of this is going to have overlap, especially for voice and tone. You're going to have a ton of overlap between your books and like your personal brand. I think this is one of those situations where you don't have to differentiate as much. So for me, I tend to go very playful with a lot of my writing for my social media posts. I also try to like hide little in jokes, and you know, I talk about eggs a lot because that's like kind of a runner joke that goes on throughout my entire series with Feathers of Dawn. Because when you talk about your books online, talking in a very conversational way can be really helpful, and talking like you would talk personally is kind of what you're going for with a brand voice and tone. And I think it can easily spread right on into your books. And I will say, I do often see authors who get this right from the start, and I think it's because we're writers. We know the value of like copy, essentially. For example, when you get into like a professional environment and people are like, well, what does copy matter? I can write something like that. ChatGPT can write it, which no, it can't. No, it can't. But you know, there is like especially in professional environments, there's a serious like misunderstanding around copy and content that I don't think indie authors have because we're writers. And so they often hit their brand voice and tone very early on, very easily. And I think taking that you use with your books and using it for your personal brand helps make them feel more cohesive together. And so then when you're kind of putting your personal brand next to your like book branding, it feels like one thing. Because ultimately, while I am suggesting that you try and distinguish yourself from your books, your branding still needs to work with your book branding. And so that is something that I really want to emphasize here, is that while I am telling you that it is important to distinguish your author brand from your book brand, you still might want to consider making sure that there's overlap throughout any of these, but particularly with voice and tone, so that they kind of all work together. Okay, I hope all of that made sense. So if you are an indie author and you are hoping to up your branding, I hope this video is helpful to you. If you're not an indie author and you were just kind of intrigued, so you clicked on this video, thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoyed me and me talking, please consider subscribing to my channel. And last but not least, if you're looking for more deep dives, video essays, things like that, you can find them up here. Also, look out for more videos. I'm trying to post every other week if possible. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you're an indie author, I wish you the best of luck. That's it. I'm gonna leave now. This is my first attempt at an unscripted video that's like not like me just talking about myself. Hope it went well. We'll see. If this ends up on the cutting room floor or I end up re-recording it, that's a different conversation. Anyway, here's the next. Had to restart my camera. Why does that not say it's recording?